Hello, and welcome back to the Sunday Morning Cafe. I'm your host, Tom Wagner. This week's podcast is a continuation of last week entitled, I Shall Die, but That's All I Shall Do for Death. It's a sequel, and that line comes from a poem by the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. Speaking of sequels, some of my readers of a certain age will remember that 1960s campy television series Batman. For my younger readers, it has almost nothing in common with the Batman movie franchise. It starred Adam West and was must see TV for boys my age. It came in two weekly episodes, separated by 48 agonizing hours. The first installment always concluded with the masked crusader's life balanced on a knife's edge. Viewers had to wait an excruciating 2 days to find out the hero's fate. Reminiscent of that series, and not to sound too dramatic, but the last episode of Sunday Morning Cafe left our main character, Mary, poised to have her skull drilled open for an endoscopic roto-rooter surgery to fix a clogged drain in her brain ventricles. I guess you could call her procedure a brain drain. And the fact that I'm using flippant rhyming words is suggestive of a happy outcome. But in real time, this was some deadly serious business. You might recall from the last podcast, according to her neurosurgeon, this exceedingly rare procedure could have had any one of four outcomes. The first one, death. Second one, a serious insult to her brain, possibly requiring the whole rest of her truncated life in a nursing home on account of serious surgery-related disabilities. Third potential outcome, no change at all. She was already moving into dementia at the relatively young age of 65. She was already suffering incontinence, and keep in mind that this physical therapist, runner, triathlete could no longer walk. So there was a pretty good chance that she'd just keep moving along that way until she died. What was the fourth potential outcome? Well, the fourth one is the one everyone was hoping for, a recovery of some portion of her capacities. So I mentioned in the last podcast that on the eve of her surgery, she met with her adult sons and her husband, who, by the way, really stuck by her all along. She wanted them to know that, and I'm quoting her here, that in no uncertain terms, she was at peace with any of the outcomes that could occur, including disability, including even death. I didn't say that to make them feel better, she insisted. I really was at peace. Check that out. At peace with disability? Even death? For real? I asked her. For real, she told me. When I heard that last part, the resilience researcher geek in me immediately stuffed two yellow legal pads into my backpack. I queued up several ballpoint pens and cleared out my schedule. I wanted to learn where a person goes to get that kind of grade A, blue ribbon, major league, gold medal brand of resilience. Selfishly, I've passed the threshold of 60 years on this planet. I'd love to know how to replicate her peace and equanimity if I can. And so, Bat friends, or Sunday Morning Cafe podcast listeners, here at the beginning of the second episode, let's pick up the story post-surgery with this question. How'd it go? In a nutshell, Mary's neurosurgeon and her healthcare team were gobsmacked by her grade A blue ribbon major league gold medal recovery. While still in the hospital, just after the surgery, this physical therapist of 40 years patient, that is Mary, was ready and raring to go. When the PT showed up, guess who was begging for a chance to relearn how to walk? Mary. That's who. I'm tempted to go na 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 Batman, but I think I'm overusing this metaphor, so I'll just say Mary. So, okay, that's the last reference I'll make to Batman. The April after her January surgery, her incontinence diaper became a thing of the past. I interviewed her 2 years later, just after she planned and hosted a 4-hour baby shower party, complete with handmade food. At one point in our interview, she had a little spontaneous moment of gratitude, and I'll quote her. Here I am, having a normal conversation in my own home with you, rather than a nursing home, quote unquote. Resilience researchers like Bruce Feller, well, or like me, have noted that listening to and learning from resilient stories has a way of enhancing the listener's own fund of resilience. After sifting through 4 hours of interviews, here's my distillation of the essential ingredients that assisted Mary to keep her equanimity and her peace through diminishment and possible death, and then ultimately to bounce back and recover. I made every effort to hoe as closely as I could to the understanding of Mary's experience that she had and the way she understood it. In the end, I showed her the written version of this and was glad when she gave it 2 thumbs up. So, it's time to get to the business of how Mary navigated these treacherous waters with such an even-keeled sense of equanimity. I've decided to place the ingredients to her resilience recipe in ascending order of importance. In other words, I'll save the main ingredients responsible for her resilience till the last end of this podcast. All right, so here we go. The first ingredient. It wasn't something she said to me as much as something she unconsciously showed me. I'll call it her methodological approach to life. Everything about Mary expressed a kind of ordered, methodological approach to living. Everywhere I cast my glance in her home, there was beauty, there was order, a kind of elegance, you might even say. In fact, in anticipation of our interview, get this, she'd prepared a step-by-step outline. It's hard to imagine a better skill set for rehabilitation. After her neurosurgery, then a combination of noticing small victories, aka gratitude practice, with B, a step-by-step methodological approach to recovery. Her strategy for getting her speech back was to firmly set her mind on having conversations with anybody who entered the room. She never, ever let fatigue be an excuse for not talking. She knew that the more she talked, the better her speech would get, but also the better her cognitive skills would improve. So, speaking of a methodological approach, as part of her recovery, Mary was determined to answer every card and every letter of a well-wisher with a handwritten card of her own. Besides scratching her gratitude itch, she was attempting to win back her handwriting skills, and again, with that, her cognitive skills. As if she were back in my first grade class with Sister Maureen Michelle, she repetitively practiced writing each word of a note multiple times before including it in her card. For example, dear, 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 Tom, 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 and so on. Sometimes a sadness or an anxiety would come with this painstaking winning back process. After all, it's not easy to relearn skills that you first mastered in first or second grade. When she'd start to get overwhelmed, she'd utilize breathing exercises to soothe herself. When her brain required rest or rejuvenation, Mary, the choral singer, would cue up a favorite Bach number or some other classical favorite. So to summarize, our first ingredient was methodological approach to life. Can you guess the second ingredient? Here's what she called it. She called it optimism. What Mary refers to as optimism frequently goes by the name positivity in resilience research. It always appears prominently in the lineup of characteristics that mark the truly resilient among us. According to Mary, she always enjoyed an optimistic outlook. When I asked if there was any way that she'd intentionally set out to develop this trait, she gently chided me. I'll quote her here. Well, think of what I did for a living for 40 years. In physical therapy, you look for and celebrate small successes, and then you build on those successes. It's easy to imagine how such an approach would help a patient in physical therapy and speech therapy. It was second nature for Mary to practice what she preached when she was the patient. In fact, while I was interviewing her, Mary's positivity got directed back toward her interviewer, that is me. Oh, that's a good question, she'd say, or a little later, you're a good listener. At the risk of sounding boastful, I took that in because Mary's not to be confused with someone to practice empty flattery or false positivity. In listening to Mary, I could see that a robust, long-standing practice of gratitude is probably what accounts for a large measure of her optimism. Check this out. To celebrate a year's worth of recovery, she posted 12 consecutive days worth of 12 articles that she wrote expressing her gratitude. In them, she noticed the kindness, the love, the expertise, and all of the various and sundry blessings visited on her throughout that journey. Clearly, Mary had developed a bone deep habit of appreciating even the smallest things, right in the midst of a hard to imagine difficulties. I came to think of her habit of appreciation as the organic material that she utilized to transform the manure of her situation into a rich compost, a compost composed of resilience enhancing optimism or positivity. Now, sports psychologists, along with some brands of cognitive psychotherapists, recommend an intentional focus on power statements aimed at what the Marines call a positive mental attitude. For example, I'm walking bravely into my future was a phrase Mary employed that provided her a kind of cognitive North Star when she was facing potential diminishment and death. She used this phrase around the time that she boldly stepped toward a risky surgery. By the way, Mary's family had a mission statement that was a kind of power statement all by itself. It revealed a kind of steely, intentional optimism that carried with it an action plan. It went like this: Team Openlander pulls in the same direction. Team Openlander pulls in the same direction. How about that? So that's the second ingredient to her resilience recipe: optimism, or what I call positivity, fed by gratitude. You want to hear the third one? Well, here it is: wide and deep social support. So here's a Jeopardy question. What was the most robust finding of the longest psychological study of adult development ever conducted in the history of modern psychology? It lasted for 80 plus years, including nearly 2,000 subjects all told. You want the answer? In Jeopardy style, here it is. What is the heart of resilience? It's relationships. Mary is nowhere near old enough to have been recruited into that study, but on the basis of my interview with her, the findings of that study, initiated in 1938, are confirmed by this study, which is built around Mary's story: a lifetime of attending to marital, familial, filial, collegial, spiritual, and communal relationships. All of those relationships have formed a wide and deep river of supportive relationships that buoyed Mary up through her illness and recovery. To describe the breadth of her supportive relationships succinctly, let me just observe that Mary's anniversary project of 12 days of 12 gratitude articles was sent to a network of over 100 people. Those individuals were the subjects of her gratitude for a variety of reasons, but suffice to say that to a greater and lesser degree, they were an extension of Team Openlander. Now, let's shift to a discussion of the depth of her support. A succinct summary statement of the depth of her caring relationships is contained in the phrase, Team Openlander pulls in the same direction. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't that long before her own bodily suffering that Mary had shouldered the care of her own mom's long illness and death. Caring and accompanying someone on that kind of a journey has a way of creating eyes to see things more clearly. As Mary began to receive the kind of care she had given her mom coming back her way, there was just zero chance that Mary would breeze past it with a lack of appreciation. I'll quote her here. I give my family a lot of credit for not saying, "There's no hope," Mary observed. In retrospect, it was a huge gamble. One wonders if part of Team Openlander's care was providing Mary the opportunity to set the direction for the whole team, despite her progressive dementia. In listening to Mary describe her husband's care for her during recovery, something deeper than appreciation appeared to be in play. It seems to me that there's a kind of taking for granted with couples like this that is actually not really a taking for granted so much as a total confidence. It's like knowing that gravity will do what gravity always has done before, so you can sort of bet on it with no doubt. Her husband Pat and Mary have this kind of rock solid taking for granted, and Mary clearly appreciates it. She described months of recovery in which Pat helped her with showering, getting dressed, feeding her, and setting her up before he left for work, only to come home and provide that same care all over again for her at the end of the day. And that's her husband. Her son, who lived here locally, would pitch in as needed, and the out-of-town son would show up to help when he could. Everything about Mary communicated that she understood that a seamless web of relationships was at the heart of her resilience and recovery. So, it's now time, now that we've talked about relationships as a vitally important part of her resilience, her equanimity, her peace, and recovery, now it's time to deal with the final and vitally important piece of all that. And I call it the soul of Mary's resilience. Depending on how you punctuate time, the deepest foundations for Mary's resilience began to be laid one layer at a time 25 years ago. It was then that she attended a workshop to learn a thing called centering prayer. Centering prayer was developed by Thomas Keating, a Benedictine monk, consistent with the traditions of Christian mysticism that you'll find in the ancient writings and monastic practices of spiritual masters through the millennia. Keating, along with his Trappist colleagues, took that tradition and crafted a practice framed in a more contemporary language, accessible to modern psychology-minded practitioners. Adoption of this methodology set Mary on a course of practice that looks on the outside very much like other forms of meditation. Twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, she, quote unquote, shows up, sits in a chair, sets a timer, and provides a 20-minute to half an hour space where her eyes are closed and she's quiet. So far, that sounds a whole lot like meditation to me. But methodological Mary is quick to draw distinctions. Her goal is contemplation, she says, rather than meditation. Contemplation, according to her, is not repeating a mantra. It's not a focus on a mandala. Contemplation, she says, is God praying in us. In Augustine of Hippo's words in the 4th century, in contemplation, one discovers a God that is closer to me than I am to myself. And you'll find that quote in his book, City of God. 10 years ago, Mary underwent training and received certification as an instructor in centering prayer with a thing called the Contemplative Outreach Center Limited. Not just any training would do, including 15 years of practice by this time in her life. This methodological woman wanted to undergo this certification process to be sure that her teaching was consistent with the format of its founder, Thomas Keating, and therefore with 1,600 years of rock-solid contemplative tradition. According to Mary, practitioners of centering prayer experience the same psychological phenomena as all people who try to meditate. For example, internal conversations, worries, to-do lists, little internal movies, recapitulation of, say, a marital conflict, and maybe 100,000 other things. As distinct from meditation, the use of a single sacred word is used not so much as a mantra, but as a symbol of consent. And this is important to her, as a symbol of consent to the God within. And so, the 20 minutes is not me trying to achieve 20 minutes of silence, Mary insists, but it's me trying to stay with my intention of consenting to God's presence and action within me. In the moment when she's actually absorbed into the mind of God, she says that she has no awareness of it. One gets the sense that awareness itself sort of falls away. She only becomes cognizant of this absorption into the God within in retrospect. When the timer goes off, she says, I'm not aware of how time flew by. Her job in this method appears to be the creation of a daily space where a reservoir of stillness can be filled. A reservoir of stillness can be filled. The events from the day deplete that reservoir, so she provides another 20-minute space for it to be refilled in the afternoon or evening. For Mary, the revelation of the transcendent within her is not so much revealed within those two daily spiritual exercises of 20 minutes to a half an hour. It's revealed in the other 23 hours of the day. God's fingerprints sculpting her heart and life within this practice show up over time in the slow transformation of the self. For example, Mary said, "In the past, there would be something that would really set me off. These days, after all these years, it doesn't have that effect anymore. Over 25 years, I get more of that, and more of that, and more of that." Eventually, she says, this is what made her at peace with the possibility of her own diminishment, even with her own death. So, as I reflect on Mary's story, it occurs to me to ask, how many times has Mary breathed in or breathed out her sacred word, her symbol of consent to the ground of her existence? Each and every time she's done that, it's been to release her grasp on, say, a pesky thought, or a story that her consciousness was just now delivering, or a to-do list, or a resentment, or just about anything that the human imagination can conjure. If one were to count how many times Mary has performed this operation, would it number in the hundreds of thousands? Would it be a million? Each time Mary has surrendered what the ego wanted to rehearse or fixate on in order to return to a silent absorption into the ground of her being, could it have been like training for the big race? Could it be that 25 years of such training allowed Mary to fully accept what is rather than what she wished was, and therefore she found peace when she needed it most? The consent that Mary has whispered in the dark for so many years was never meant to bend God to her ego's wishes. It's always been the other way around. That well-developed muscle served her well through the equivalent of a pretty tough ultramarathon. Maybe even you could call it an ultramarathon to the power of some infinite number. When listening to this part of her story, it's not hard to resonate with the words of the observant diner in the movie When Harry Met Sally. Remember that? I'll have what she's having. Mary insists that, like a habit of physical exercise, it may be hard to get used to at first, but over time you'll eventually look forward to it. Ever since this interview 4 years ago, and in large measure because of this interview, I've been practicing centering prayer twice a day. If listening to this podcast makes you feel compelled, like I did, to have what Mary's having, you can search the words Contemplative Outreach Limited. No matter what city you live in or near, you'll find coaches and workshops to instruct you in this practice. And there's a wide array of books that can also help you with this project. I'll just mention them here. Cynthia Bourgeau's Centering Prayer. James Finley has a podcast called Turning to the Mystics that covers this ground. Thomas Keating's own book, Open Mind, Open Heart, is an excellent place to start. And I really like Martin Laird's Into the Silent Land, that book. And Basil Pennington, I'm not sure if it's in print or not, but it's a very simple and easy to read book, Centering Prayer. It reads like a cookbook. So what's happening for me this week is that my mom, who's graduated out of hospice 2 other times, doesn't look like she's going to graduate in the same way this time. It looks like she's going to graduate into the next, she's going to transition into passing away and dying. And so the following epilogue that I'm going to put out will appeal to anyone who's in the process of dealing with the death of somebody you love. It's a story of Mary's having an experience right around the time she had her surgery that is a pretty up close and personal brush with the transcendent that I think you'll enjoy hearing. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing about Mary and her journey here. I know, as you can see, it's changed my life. And whether or not it changed your life, I sure hope it opened up some curiosity into what Mary's having these days and what I've been having these days. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and hopefully you'll hear from me next week. Okay, bye now.